Alright guys, it's time to launch back into our story of Scotland. Okay, so we left off with King Edward's triumphal ride through the country in 1303. And we also talked about how that didn't really accomplish very much, and how he was going to have to find a way to go after the guerrilla armies that were roaming Scotland, instead of just taking over towns and castles. So the next year, 1304, King Edward sent another army into Scotland on a special assignment. Hang on a minute. How many years are we into this now? He's been going after the crown since at least 1292. Though we could say he had ideas about it quite some time before that. But still, we're 12 years into this deal now. I mean, this guy just doesn't give up. Anyway, the army. King Edward ordered them to seek out the armies of William Wallace and Simon Frazer, the two greatest remaining men that stood against him, and destroy them. This bloodhound kind of tactic proved much more effective than triumphal marches and bombardment of castles. The two Scottish bands were soon discovered and scattered to the winds by the English troops. It seemed as if the death blow had been struck to any hope of Scotland's independence. Once Wallace and Frazer's men were gone, all of the greatest Scottish nobles who still dared to resist found no more will to do so. One by one, they came and pledged their swords to Longshanks, as Bruce had done. And the king rewarded them with something close to clemency, at least as close as he could ever come to that word. He did not kill them all as traitors, but instead forced them to pay great fines in order to keep their lands and castles. Although some of those nobles he was the most angry with, he did send away to other countries in exile for a time. Other than that, though, no further punishments were to be meted, and it was agreed that the Scottish and English prisoners would be exchanged. Oh yeah, that's nice. 'Cause Edward's a nice guy. Not. There were two names that were missing from all these lovely peace dealings, however, and those were William Wallace and John de Solis. Edward had specifically refrained from extending the hand of mercy to them. In a country filled with turncoats and selfish politicians, these two brave men had refused to stain their honor. They were true Scotsmen to the last, victory or no victory. De Solis chose to remain abroad in France, rather than bow the knee to a king that was not his own. But Wallace chose to remain in Scotland, with the tiny band of brothers-in-arms that was left to him. Even with all of Scotland's nobles kneeling at his feet, Edward refused to be content so long as Wallace refused to call him king. It seems strange, given the fact that Wallace was not really even a noble. But Edward knew how great of a leader Wallace was among his people, and he knew that if he gained a following and rose up again, the nobles may be tempted to follow his impudent ways and rise up in arms. He intended to make an end of this rebel, to frighten the nobles from ever drawing the sword towards him again. King Edward offered a great reward to anyone who would capture Wallace, and actually commanded several of the Scottish nobles to aid in the hunt. And as a further stimulus, he specified that James Stewart and Ingram de Umfreville would never be allowed to return from their exiles, until this so-called traitor was brought to justice. With this blood hunt set in motion, Edward turned to wrapping up the biggest loose end of his Scottish conquest. Stirling Castle. You may remember the name of Stirling from the time I told you the grand story of the Battle of Stirling Bridge. I told you then that Stirling was a very important town in Scotland, and the key to the Highlands of the North. And so, you see, Edward wished that he might have the castle there, which was being still stubbornly held by a man named William Oliphant. In fact, Edward wanted the castle so badly that he spent 3 months trying to take it for his own. 12 catapults and trebuchets pounded the walls with great stones, until at last Oliphant and his men saw that they could withstand him no more, and they offered to surrender. But Edward wasn't finished yet. The past 3 months, 5 of his master carpenters and 49 other workers had been toiling away at perhaps the greatest war machine of that century. Warwolf. This gigantic trebuchet was larger than any that had ever been built before, and perhaps larger than any that was built thereafter, as far as we can tell. It took 30 wagons to carry all the parts to the site of the siege, and Edward was not about to lose an opportunity to test it. He refused to accept Oliphant's surrender, and instead let Warwolf loose upon the castle for a full 24 hours. Then, once he had sufficiently proven his irresistible might, he let the garrison go, and locked poor Oliphant away in the Tower of London. Robert Bruce and the Bishop William Lamberton were there with the English, watching the wanton destruction of Stirling. You may remember that these two once served as joint guardians of Scotland, alongside of John Comyn. And here they stood on the other side now, as silent witnesses of their countrymen's destruction. Silent, but perhaps not willing. As King Edward was busying himself with the matters of the siege, the two Scotsmen met in secret together. They formed an agreement, a friendship and alliance against all men, they called it, that one day they would free Scotland, with Robert Bruce as their king, and Lamberton representing the support of the church. They swore that if either of them should break this agreement, he would owe the other man a full £10,000. Quite a large sum for that day. So you see, even in his highest moment of triumph over Scotland, King Edward had no idea what was going on beneath the surface, betwixt his seemingly complacent new subjects. It wasn't until May of the following year, 1305, that an official parliament was held to settle the new politics of Scotland. In short, it was basically to be treated as a province of England. Well, worse than a province, actually. For unlike Kent, Northumberland, or other counties of England, which had their own native sheriffs and justices that sprang from their own blood and soil, Scotland could not. Her justices had to be appointed in pairs, one Scottish and one English for each province. And her sheriffs could only be Scotsmen so long as they didn't cover an area of importance, such as Stirling. Those jobs were left to Englishmen. Their king was not their own, but one who had destroyed their land, and with his nephew, the Earl of Richmond, reigning over them as a sort of under-governor. Bruce, Comyn, and Lamberton, the old triune of guardians, were reduced to nothing more than appointed advisors to the English Earl. Wallace alone remained as the last active threat against the regime. He refused to see himself or his country under the domination of England. For many months he was able to evade the searches made for him. But at last, on August 3rd of 1305, he was captured by a band of English soldiers. Not just any band of English soldiers, mind you, but ones in the pay of a disgraceful Scotsman, Sir John Menteith. Brave Wallace was bound and led all the long way to London, stopping briefly at Menteith's castle of Dumbarton. Obviously, the picture I have here looks quite a bit more modern than the era we're looking at, because, unfortunately, much of the old structure has broken down or been destroyed over the years. You can still kind of see parts of the old castle up in the cliffs, though. It must have been pretty imposing in its day. Pretty perfect bad guy castle, actually. Here's a close-up of an arch that is probably from the period when Wallace came here. In the Great Judgment Hall of Westminster, in London, a fake trial was held, and Wallace was officially pronounced as a traitor to King Edward of England, and a murderer who spared neither age nor sex, neither monk nor nun. He answered the charges defiantly. "I cannot be a traitor, for I owe him no allegiance. He is not my sovereign, he never received my homage, and whilst life is in this persecuted body, he shall never receive it. To the other points whereof I am accused, I freely confess them all. As governor of my country, I have been an enemy to its enemies. I have slain the English. I have mortally opposed the English king. I have stormed and taken the towns and castles which he unjustly claimed as his own. If I or my soldiers have plundered or done injury to the houses or ministers of religion, I repent me of my sin. But it is not of Edward of England I shall ask pardon." But, alas, truth was not a thing to be considered. Wallace met a brutal traitor's death before a watching crowd in London, just as bravely as he had ever met any foe or battle. Scotland's greatest defender was dead, but the spirit of freedom was still alive.